to Ilse, she said, no, I don't want you to interview me. And I thought, oh, is there something I said that's wrong? And she said, no, I want this to be more of a conversation. I heard you once talk and say that you started your first business at the age of 14. That sounds like a very young age to start a business. What kind of business was it?
It was a chemistry business, actually. No, the true story is because of all this running, I wanted to really get into a formal training program, and it cost money. And my dad said, well, go find the money. And so I started a cake baking business. So it was chemistry. And I became pretty efficient at baking vast numbers of cakes between Thursday night and Saturday, so that I could use the rest of the time running. Of course, in hindsight, my mother was a saint, because I'm sure I made a gigantic mess of her kitchen every weekend. But I made enough money to actually do everything I wanted to do in that, and it was a great experience. But eventually it was enough, and I have to say, I don't think I have baked a large cake since the end of that adventure.
So, in your story, you stopped in Oxford, in England. What brought you to Canada, and what were your first thoughts when you came to Canada? You lived in South Africa as well as England, but Canada must have been. I hope you came in the summer months, not in the winter months.
Yeah, well, it was detours of life. I met a young man from Woodstock, Ontario, in Oxford, and we made a deal that I would see if I would survive the winter, and came to Canada as a result of that, and eventually married him. So it was one of those things. I never had any plans to come to Canada. But I would say, I am probably one of those incredibly fierce, not so new now, but still new Canadians. I just count myself as extraordinarily fortunate that I've been able to live and work here and raise my kids here and build a life here.
Well, we certainly do have an amazing system in place. I lived myself in San Francisco for 4 years, and I think it was leaving here and living there and then facing the reality of the lack of that social system, the lack of things to fall back on like that really taught me that I do live in the best country in the world, and when I came back to Canada, I embraced it with open arms. But there are some differences when it comes to entrepreneurship here in Canada and business growth, and we have some challenges in Canada that I think makes it really attractive for people to look to the US, look to especially San Francisco, who here kind of dreams of going down to Silicon Valley. No, there's no noise. Yeah, I mean it's pretty amazing. It is the epicenter of all sorts of advancement. And if you're into startups and into technology, I remember when I left Toronto, I had been saying, to whatever employers or clients that I had at the time, oh, you just don't understand where the world is going. And when I went down to San Francisco, I said, you guys don't understand that other people outside of San Francisco don't understand where the world is going, because they were so far ahead. It was like beyond the bleeding edge, right? Your brain is always going, you're always meeting people that are building and making and doing interesting things. But I really wanted to bring a lot of that back to Canada with me, and found that there are a few hiccups in both Canadian culture as well as policies in our system and that sort of thing. I'm sure with your vast experience with entrepreneurship in Canada and BC, you have some insights into what it is that holds Canada back a little bit from being real leaders in business and even entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I think my insights are probably what we all know. We have structural, structural issues. We have a giant country, geographically, big floppy country, and 32 million people spread over this vast geography. And, you know, density of activity, whether it's talent, ideas, money, all that stuff really matters. And in that context, you know, Silicon Valley is also a complete outlier in the context of the US. I think we forget that there, you know, Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, maybe are incredible hotspots, but there are lots of places in the US that have similar challenges. But the scale and then, you know, associated small market, effectively small local market, very few strong technology receptors that can try and test, you know, startup products as you would find in those markets. Lack of capital that's risk-taking is a huge issue and continues to be a huge issue. It's getting a little better in the IT space. Still in areas like life sciences, it's a massive problem. And it's a young ecosystem, so we don't have the same density of management talent and serial entrepreneurs. But, you know, I don't know about your experience, but I would say the last 5, 6, 8 years, we've seen a huge transformation in Toronto in terms of just the energy level on every dimension of that. And the thing that and I don't see the same flow of companies to the valley. So, and I think that's that's our collective challenge, is how do we actually create an environment where we give good companies the best shot possible to grow into global companies from here. Because there's lots of reasons why people actually want to live here, and you know that is increasingly true. But the reality is they have to be global right from the beginning, because their first customer is likely not here. It's a very conservative early adopter market, and they they need to be able to really get to scale, and we give them consistently 1/3 of the risk capital their competitors south of the border would get. So there's lots of logical explanations, but then the flip side of that is the talent we have in this country is just extraordinary. So we're very good, and even per capita, we start about the same number of companies as some of the best jurisdictions. Our companies just don't grow big enough. But we now have this extraordinary flood of talent from all over the world. And shift, you know, one of the things we're seeing at Mars that I'm really excited about is traditionally Canadian startups in the tech spaces that I've been involved in, you know, they've looked at the US market as their first customer, first funding and all of that. And that's changing now. We're seeing more and more companies started by diaspora entrepreneurs, and they're building products for Africa, for South America, for China, for India, and not really that interested in the US market. So what if we could really take advantage of that as an economic strategy, and not just try to, you know, show up on somebody's radar in Silicon Valley. The world's a big place, and there's a lot of market pull in a lot of other places. So.
Yeah, and there are a lot of markets that are actually way more interesting than the U.S. As far as markets go. Do you know of any programs that help you bridge to, say, China or say Europe or Africa or any other continents or countries out there?
I mean, I think a lot of the programs are trying to figure out how to do that more effectively, and certainly, you know, we're grappling with that. We're seeing some interesting slipstreaming happening of young companies partnering with established Canadian companies that have been doing business in Brazil for a while, and sort of, you know, being able to slipstream behind. I think EDC, for example, is trying really hard to work with younger companies. Not so much just with things that you can finance off a balance sheet, and they're not quite there yet. But I don't think we have a plan. Does Canada have a plan to really take advantage of this? No, but we got to get with it.
I think I saw some posters with arrows with the word "plan" on them. Back there.
Yeah, that's the question. Ilse, I guess you've been at Mars Mars for about 10 years now. There's a lot of commentary around Mars in general. There's the whole sort of real estate element of Mars, and there's sort of issues that it's dealt with. Leaving that all aside, when you sort of look at it, what do you see the role of Mars being in the context of the community, and how have you seen it change over the last 10 years? And what would you say would be your 2 or 3 most significant accomplishments? Not just from a personal point of view, but from a team point of view over the last sort of 10 years in this environment.
So the concept as it was originally perceived, and there are lots of models that you can look at around the world, and obviously Mars borrows from some of the innovation district models in other places, was really to say, how do we build a platform that can bring together all the capacity of what is a unique thing in Canada. If we talk about our density problem, the downtown core and its academic strength. So we spend almost $2 billion a year on research in 10 city blocks in Toronto. So one of the mandates of Mars was we need to create an environment where that enterprise, which is really the fuel for the big breakthrough ideas for the future, can connect better with business, because it lived in somewhat splendid isolation. So a huge part of the first part of that, of Mars's history was to, the building became available when it was going to be sold, the hospital, the old Toronto General Hospital. So the first part was very much building that physical place and essentially co-locating not just the pointy-headed academics and not just startups, but sort of all the players in the ecosystem. That set of collisions that will lead to not just new collaborations, but also accelerating some of the academic startups. And so that's a big piece of work that is quite specific to the research and academic community, which is a part of our feeder system. The second, I think, task was really to try and build resources that can help some of the best companies to get to scale. As I said, we start lots of companies, but how do we get some of the ones? And we focus more on the ones that are, come from a science system, just partly because of where we're located. And so I think if you look at Mars's trajectory, I'm not a patient person, but these things take time. So building the infrastructure, and it is infrastructure that is more relevant to companies that need specialized infrastructure. If you're a software startup and you can build in your basement, Mars's labs are not that important. If you came to Mars Mornings this morning, Cameron Piron talking about his company Synaptive Medical that started in our incubator, he is developing both a medical device and imaging technology for neurosurgery. So building the infrastructure and then a suite of sort of resources ranging from very introductory, stir up more aspiring entrepreneurs to get a place to connect. Our programs are very heavily used by new Canadians who are more entrepreneurial and trying to dock into the programs. And then the second piece was, really doubling down on the companies that are making progress. So I think our accomplishments so far are very clearly, we've built a set of infrastructure that's now there and is going to be there for the next decades to come, with very specialized resources. And leading cities around the world have exactly this infrastructure at scale. So we have that platform here now. And then if you look at the companies that are using Mars, and our big problem is volume of companies needing our services. Very, very good companies are coming to those services. And I think the third piece that we're working on very hard, which is not as visible to the outside world, is exactly this issue of how do we actually create better test beds for our technology in Canada. So just to give you one example, we have in Ontario, 14 million people, single-payer healthcare system, well-regarded healthcare system. Over the last 10 years, we have a specific body that buys medical technology devices and diagnostics. The last 10 years, we haven't bought one technology out of Ontario. So $2 billion of research in our backyard, And we have no capacity to actually buy our technology. So we now have a very specific program called Excite that is working with the healthcare system, startups, big companies, policymakers, the regulator, and we are now channeling 19 technologies through that process, generating the evidence the system needs to actually buy and forcing the system to commit that if these young companies get the evidence you want, you don't want systems to buy stupid stuff, that they will adopt. So we work at these three levels of, resources for individuals, people like yourselves who are, I want to learn about 3D printing, I want to learn about regulations for medical devices, I want to learn about crowdfunding, I want to learn about social finance. A place where you can, without going back to school, come and recharge and learn stuff, meet other people. Very targeted programs in clean tech, health, and IT. And then increasingly this role as the convener of the system to make it more receptive so that we can use our healthcare system not just as a thing that takes care of sick people, but actually as an economic engine, so that companies can test their devices and then go international. And I think the interesting learning for us from a Mars perspective is that role, and I didn't see it at first, to be honest, but that role of Mars is a weird thing. It's not government, it's not business, it's not academe, but it sits in the middle, actually gives us real capability around some of this sort of opening up the systems. And I think that's a very unique role, because often entrepreneurs with a really cool product, they can't figure out, why the hell can't I sell to the energy system? Why don't utilities buy my stuff? We have 150 education startups. They can sell to China easier than they can sell to the Toronto District School Board.
It sounds like there's so many things going on at Mars that a lot of people don't see day to day, including you just mentioned to me that you house the world's largest open source biology lab, which that is, I don't know, for me, an open source advocate, that's very exciting. That's amazing kind of research that could actually go to create all sorts of opportunities in the biotech space.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary, it's called the Structural Genomics Consortium, and it's run by a genius guy called Al Edwards. It's actually a very interesting partnership between the University of Toronto, Oxford University, and Karolinska in Sweden. And essentially they have brought in millions and millions of dollars of research money from pharma companies, as well as government agencies and so on. And they do basically pre-competitive, very rapid assessment of technologies to decrease the failure rate of drug candidates. So, toxicity testing and everything else, and it's all in the open domain. So, and it's the largest efforts of its kind. It's very interesting how the pharma companies are really at the table now, writing $10 million pop checks to get access to this information. And because of the nature of the collaboration globally, they can get through this sort of factory approach of screening these compounds much, much faster than any of the pharmas can do on their own. So over time, I think that's going to carve out a very interesting commercial opportunity for us if we're smart about it. So, this is the stuff I think that's on our plate, right? So stem cells were discovered in downtown Toronto just over 50 years ago. Absolutely transformational scientific discovery. These things take time. Now we are at the cusp of the regenerative medicine and stem cell industry taking off globally. Over these 50 years, we've built incredible research capacity. Toronto has the highest concentration of top-ranked stem cell scientists. But if we don't build the companies that are going to commercialize those technologies right here, we are just training. When you send your kid to do a great postgraduate degree at the University of Toronto in stem cell science, they are going to have to go work in Singapore or Silicon Valley.
Any bioengineers in the room? Anyone? I saw a hand up go up.
I'm not a biotech engineer, that's why I didn't raise my hand.
That's all right.
But I know some that are doing amazing things in Toronto. I had an anecdote in the comments.
Yeah.
So first, I was in the elevator today, and I thought I recognized somebody on your team. I asked him if he was from Mars, and he gave me a really weird look.
Because he wasn't from Mars.
He wasn't from Mars.
We get that question a lot.
No, he was from Venus.
And the comment was that until very recently, for startups outside of the actual building, I and the people around me, everything I heard was, hey, you should become a Mars client because they'll give you $20,000 or $30,000 worth of free market research. Period. And I said until recently because I've noticed over like the last 6 months, there has been a transformation in the services offered where it's really geared towards what you're saying there, getting your first customers, not just in the medtech industry, but edtech and the other clusters that are covered by ICE. And just wanted to share that I see this change really happening in Mars.
So I would say that the stage of if you go back to that sort of stages of evolution. So a lot of the first activity, and I think a lot of us have been part of that sort of building of the ecosystem in Toronto and all its different parts, and when we need all those different parts. I think that pump is now primed. We had literally thousands of people coming to our introductory entrepreneurship programs. We built market research capability very early on, particularly because we deal with a lot of science-based innovators, and they live in a very specialized world, and so getting market information to them early as possible is very useful, and that's a free service that's now available to Ontario companies. And I would we have a fantastic market research team.
They are fantastic.
They are superb. But now that sort of pump is primed, we are focusing our resources more on the companies that are kind of taking off and really ready to engage with customers, and beefing up our corporate engagement very significantly for that reason. And I think that is about how do we create better receptors and test beds, not just in Canada, but also using some of those international companies to help pull into markets. And so it's a big shift in how we're spending our resources, partly I think just reflecting how the ecosystem has also evolved. Because there's lots of startup activity everywhere, and so trying to figure out where can we be more relevant to the networks we have.
Yeah, and a lot of people forget as well, there's over 100 years of history going into the development of the Silicon Valley region as far as being an innovative area. Bell was creating all sorts of amazing technology there at the turn of the last century, and then throughout over the years with Stanford University and lots of this work that had gone in behind it. So hats off to 10 years really advancing this in Toronto.
Well, I think the other thing we forget about Canada, which I think means we can't just think of ourselves as a 10% version of the US, right? That's sort of our industrial strategy. We're about 10%, and we just kind of do this diet version of the US. Like Israel, we don't have a military-industrial complex, and a huge amount of that innovation capacity in the US has been fueled by the military-industrial complex. And so we don't have that. We do have a lot of money in Canada, but most of it was made in resources and real estate. So we're transitioning some of that investment capacity without this framework of a military-industrial foundation, and which means a lot of our research is concentrated in our academic centers, and we don't have sophisticated receptors. If you're in Boston, you can find a high-tech company probably in your neighborhood that you can talk to. Most of our big companies are branch plants, and they don't have necessarily sophisticated research here. So there's these structural issues which just I think forces us to think about a unique Canadian approach to building this capacity over time. It also says, we should make some choices. And we hate making choices in Canada, right? We'd rather have tax credits because that way anybody can apply. It doesn't make a decision.
So should we like go back to our pioneering spirits, our community building? I mean, there's a lot that's going on. I mean, I think a lot of people, myself included, expected Mars to be sort of like this big fancy co-working space.
I wish, trying to work that as a financial model.
I actually dropped, when I came back to Toronto, I dropped in there to, pull up a desk and some Wi-Fi and realized that wasn't the space for it. There's a lot more going on behind the scenes, but we have tons of amazing co-working spaces that fill that need. A lot of people in the community that are working really hard, and events like this, Startup Grind, and First Tuesdays, and all sorts of amazing events that are happening in the community that create this great ecosystem around entrepreneurship, around startups, around technology and innovation, and getting together. For those of us that struggle to get out to those events, sometimes I don't get to as many of them as I want to, but it's there, and I think that's very Canadian. Very much so, pulling up the socks together in a lot of ways. Anything else? Oh, there's one in the back, or a couple in the back.
For a young entrepreneur who, on that note, was debating 3 different events in the entrepreneurial space tonight, what role do you see as Mars having within an ever-increasingly and excitingly increasingly crowded kind of entrepreneurial innovation ecosystem in Toronto? And what types of partnerships is Mars looking to pursue in the future with these various new programs and things that are starting up?
So, I mean, it depends a bit on the sector. So within each of our sort of 3 broad sectors of IT, health, and clean tech, we have, so tonight we launched our retail and e-commerce cluster where there's a very specific group of corporate partners, startup partners, VC partners involved in that, and it's very much about accelerating some of the key companies. Last week we held a very big investment forum for an event called Health Kick, which was Canada's largest investment forum for health startups, there's still a shortage. So I think that we partner probably with 150 different organizations in these different pieces, and sometimes at their locations, sometimes at our locations. And in those partnerships, I think all of us, because we know the event space are getting more crowded, it's a question of finding, the right piece where your event contributes something that's not there. I don't think anybody's interested in doing more events just, to compete with each other. And I think it's really encouraging to see the level of energy and collaboration and shared content that's going across all of these different events. Our events range very much from introductory stuff all the way to very deep dive workshops that are very technical. And I think my encouragement would just be, look at the events calendar on the Mars space and find the pieces that are relevant to you, and you'll bump into us at many, many other events in other places. And if there's an event that you think we could help with or should stop doing, tell us, because, it's all about stuff that matters. We really try also to get a lot of feedback from participants in our events to make sure that they, the events work for the people that come to them, because time is our most important non-renewable resource, and it's true for all of us. So I think that's the challenge. But there's so much energy that I think, it's great that there are choices for different kinds of events, even if they are a little bit in the same space, because we want all these networks to fire on all cylinders, right? If we want the lift that we want as a community. I think you'll find our stuff sometimes to be a bit more on the heavy technical side, just because of the nature of our community.
Some more the green shirt.
So both of you were talking about to make Canada be heard and be seen on a global level. So my question will be, last week in OECD, there will be a Chinese investor delegation group there to be part of the panel. And I Singapore's mayor, John Tory, is planning a trip coming to India. So as like industrial leader or pioneer, what is Mars' program or plan to have these global connections?
I will say in this, sort of coming through the startup phase, this is a huge priority for us right now. So we've had a huge amount of interest from different jurisdictions, and we're now at the stage where we're choosing the partnerships that we want to really go deep on. So we have a number of them in the works. So for example, 2 weeks ago, we hosted here a series of Chinese groups. We have 2 particular Chinese partnerships we're very excited about. One is with STIC, which is the Shanghai Technology Innovation Center. And just so that we are very clear, if we talk about Canada's performance globally, it's not just about what we do. And I think we all see Canada's indicators, getting worse. And it's frustrating for us because as a country, I think we're doing a lot of the right things. We're investing in our universities, all that stuff. But the reality is everybody else is doing more. So the Shanghai Technology Innovation Center is the Mars sort of equivalent in Shanghai. Shanghai has the population of Canada. There are 150 Mars equivalents in Shanghai. China has a Torch program, which is their business incubation strategy. Talk about a plan. At the beginning of this year, they had 1,500 business incubators, most of them bigger than Mars. And there's a complete strategy that targets different sectors, different geographies, and we're not talking research parks, we're not talking industrial parks, that's a whole other program. We're just talking about working on startups. So, why is Mars, from my perspective, really important that we get it right? Is because that's the competition. Just came back from Hong Kong, which is another partner of ours. Population of 7 million people, about half of Ontario, if you want to think about it that way. We have 1.5 million square feet at Mars doing what we do. There are 2 big centers, 4 million square feet and 1 million square feet. So the challenge for us is how do we build partnerships to land, for our companies to land in those markets? And so the Shanghai Technology Innovation Center, Biopolis in Singapore, Mission Bay for companies in San Francisco that need life sciences space. Those are the partnerships we're building right now. But if you look at leading cities around the world, they all have some version of this. And so we're using our sort of collective strength as a center to find those partnerships, so that we can build relationships that are reciprocal for those companies coming from those markets who want to get into North America, who see Toronto as an interesting landing spot for North America to come here, and vice versa. We have a very interesting partnership with the UAE, where again, they are absolutely focused on building the UAE, not just as a transportation hub, but as a new technology hub. We just completed a study for them designing their next generation intellectual property office. So smart. They have figured out exactly what they want to do in terms of intellectual property to make the UAE a hub for intellectual property to penetrate both the Middle East and Africa. So that's what's happening in the rest of the world. And, we have to find the partnerships that will accelerate our effort, but in that process, it has to be a mutual exchange. So there's no recipe book, so everybody in these hubs are all trying to figure out how to do this. And what I find encouraging is everybody's learning from each other, because it's not like there's a simple answer. But that's our competition.
So the study that you did for the UAE, is it going to be published openly, or is it something that they
paid for it, fee for service, part of.
I'd love to see that.
But what it allowed us to do is to actually benchmark all of the models of intellectual property transitions, and so we're a lot smarter now, talking to them and to others.
There's more.
Jim Caselli had an article in the Globe, I think it was today, probably didn't get a chance to look at it Another comment that he made was sort of the university accelerator and sort of public sector-led accelerator model needs to be focused on exits. He also, but the overarching sort of thrust of his comments was that government and government policy is not really focused or hasn't delivered and working in tandem on advancing Canadian business interests globally. So, do you have any thoughts on any of those things? And you know, particularly if we're looking at a knowledge-driven emergence here in Toronto, IP policy in particular, you just mentioned.
And I think, you know, Jim is very focused on intellectual property policy, obviously based on his experiences at RIM, and feels that we're absolutely, you know, asleep at the switch.
I mean, he basically said that, you know, the U.S. courts are an arm of business interests in the United States.
Yeah. And it's, you know, it is an increasingly complex landscape to navigate. So I completely agree with him. We have to get a lot smarter. And there's this, you know, this interesting tension between open source, open innovation, you know, collaborative discovery, and at the same time, you know, the brutal reality of commercializing a drug takes, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars. And unless you have protection, people don't invest. So you have to be careful what you wish for, because otherwise, you know, promising drugs may never make it to a patient. So I think he's absolutely spot on. What, you know, what needs to be done there, I think, is a long and probably complex argument, and I think he's putting a lot of pressure on the federal government to beef up our efforts to become smarter, which also means, you know, we need to educate students better about intellectual property. Our law schools have to focus more on intellectual property. You can't, there's no easy fix to that as a challenge. But, and you know, a lot of what Jim said is absolutely correct. I mean, I thought he was a bit disingenuous when he takes the cumulative revenue of Stanford and MIT and compare it to the annual revenue from U of T, which I don't think is a fair comparison. But there's no question that we underperform still on commercialization of research. Part of the problem is this lack of receptors. Part of the problem is our granting councils, which fund a lot of our basic research. We spit stuff out of our academic centers very raw. Some of you may have heard in the US about SBIR programs, a lot of other through the National Science Foundation and the large NIH grants. You get commercialization grants that are substantial, which means you can get the technology to a proof of concept. So what we do is we spit it out as really raw science, and we don't have the angel community or the sophisticated tech companies who will pick up that raw technology. And so the end result is we tend to sell it to international companies in that early stage form at the lowest value point in commercialization. So one of the jobs of Mars, you know, going back to the earlier question, was to fix that tech transfer system. So one of the projects we embarked on is we created a sister organization called Mars Innovation, which now takes all of the intellectual property coming out of 16 academic institutions in downtown Toronto. So U of T, Ryerson, York, all of the teaching hospitals, and a couple of big research institutes, bringing all of that intellectual property into a single storefront so that you can get more robust intellectual property bundles. You can put stuff together from multiple institutions and invest in it so that you, hopefully, if you start a company or you license, you have a better product to do business with. And also to create a better interface with the outside world. In the past, if you were a Boston-based VC and you were interested in medical technology, you go to SickKids. You go to SickKids' tech transfer office, and they would show you what they have on their desk. They wouldn't send you across the street to UHN, because they had no idea what was on UHN's desk. So the whole idea here is to create a more intelligent storefront so that partners can better engage with us so that we can get to scale. And so that experiment is running now. There's about 35 companies that have come out of that Mars Innovation pipeline. Still early days. We still need the bigger wins out of that, funnel. But we now have the machinery and some very, very interesting companies. Exogenic is one that's located not too far from here, as an example. But a lot of what he says is absolutely correct. If the fixes were easy, we would have probably be there.
So you've covered a number of different areas. You've got a volume of groups that are coming through the community service. You've got all these issues around structure. And as I'm listening, I'm thinking, so besides everything, what is it particularly that keeps you up at night in terms of Mars accomplishing what it's set out to do?
You know what keeps me up at night is the unintended consequences. So I think we are much better now at, there's a lot more activity in the community. We've mobilized these intellectual property feeder systems. We're getting better at starting companies with the right management talent. The thing that is still not happening enough is enough early stage capital being in those companies. So to put it crudely, if we really dress up the best opportunities and can really showcase them, they become even easier to pick out. And if there's no local capital in these companies, it's just really easy to move them when they're little. So that is, I think, the thing that we need to do, and you can't put a fence around them. So it is about starting the best companies possible and making sure all those different things that they need can be accessed by them, including access to international markets, so they can keep growing from here, because the stronger their root system is, the more likely they are to get to scale here. In which case, the economic benefit will accrue here. But unless that funding piece gets fixed over time, I think that's still a big risk for us, particularly in the projects like healthcare and clean tech, which you cannot do without proper risk funding. You can't do them in your basement with no money, right? It's just not possible.
I just have a question a bit, because we're all startup people here, and Mars was probably a startup at one point. And I recall when John Evans pitched Mars and it sort of started. I just wondered, there's a startup story at Mars as well, and you've been involved for some time. So is there anything, the startups pivot, they change? Is there anything historically that you've done that's a little positive, or things that you would do differently? I'm curious about that.
I think that is the part of the Mars story that is not well understood, right? It's if you think back about the history, so the old Toronto General Hospital, which is the brown building of Mars, became redundant in a hospital restructuring and was going to be sold to a condominium dude. And the hospital was quite far along in that process, when basically a group of business leaders, with John Evans at the lead, basically said, we can't let this happen. If this thing gets sold to condominium, the ownership will be distributed. And it's such a strategic location in the heart of this discovery district that we can't let that happen. So within a very short period of time, they raised $14 million from 14 individuals to stop the hospital from selling the land. It was not as if they had a beautiful, baked business plan and revenue model and all of that, right? So it was a big, crazy idea in 2000. And so between 2000 and 2003, the hospital, though was decrepit, it was still a functioning hospital. So research programs, patients had to be moved. And in that period, certainly they looked at all the international examples to try and see what they could borrow. But then the process started. So the first thing is they said, we don't want to be in the real estate business. Let's find a developer to build what we think. They were unsuccessful because the business case was not clear cut, and Canadian investors didn't want to fight. So they basically raised the money and did the development themselves. So it is a classic story of a hugely visible project that raised money just in time through all of that early period. And it was a very hard, so when I joined in 2005, Mars had 1 employee for the first 3 years. It was all volunteers. And so when I joined, it was just before the building opened, so, you know, to get more involved on the programming side. And I came because John Evans asked me, and he was the greatest Canadian I ever knew. There wasn't any more complicated than that. And I thought, here's this amazing guy who's trying to build this big idea. You know, let's see if we can help. That's sort of how that started. But again, at that point, it was a very nascent idea. A lot of the early energy was just in trying to get the infrastructure built. When you go to Hong Kong, how did they fund their Mars equivalent? The government gave in 2000 a nonprofit $1 billion worth of land and said, sell off a chunk of it and build high-density real estate, high-density houses, apartments, and use the rest of that profit to build your innovation center. So here it was literally cobbled together like a classic social enterprise with, you know, donations, some government funding, and then going to the market and raising $130 million. So how would you do that differently? If you had a choice, you'd do it differently. That was way too hard a way to do it. But I don't think people understand how exposed the project was in those early days. And in terms of now, I think the big challenge for us, and it's, you know, it's the true challenge of the accelerating pace of change, is how do we continue to really stay at the leading edge of innovation? We are at a time of such extraordinary transformation. And now that Mars is there, we have this toolbox. How do we make the biggest impact with it? Given that, in that period, 2008 to 2010 happened, we developed phase 2 with a private developer out of the US who stopped the project because of what happened in the rest of their world. And, what you read in the press over the last while is Mars digging itself out of a $350 million hole left by a US developer as a nonprofit with no balance sheet. It's a hard problem to solve. But now that we have this toolbox, and we all have our sets of toolboxes in the ecosystem, how do we stay hungry? How do we stay alert to the pace of change? Because the rest of the world is doubling down on this stuff big time.
So Ilse, I wonder if there's like a little metaphor here for startups in general around the beginnings, the humble beginnings of Mars. It's a different bootstrapping story than we usually hear, right? But it was a bootstrapping story, is a bootstrapping story. And that when you're bootstrapping like that, even if it is with millions of dollars versus tens of thousands of dollars, every decision has to be very mindful, right? So that gave probably John and crew more time to think in early days about what this was going to be, rather than putting something together big and flashy and then going in the wrong direction because they had all this money. I've seen this time and time again with my travels through various different startup communities. I was just in Bloomington, Indiana, where they're doing a very similar sort of center to Mars, or they've the proposals out to the city right now. I've seen this in many other smaller centers where there is an outcry where there's like not enough money. And look at all the money that's been given to startups in Silicon Valley, Boston, New York. But at the same time, what they're building out of these centers is so meaningful, and there's an amazing community that comes behind what they're doing, and they're building things that I think will sustain as well. And Mars is a great story. It's definitely, if you could go back, there would be easier ways. But at the same time, I wonder how much of that struggle actually went into, like, the thoughtfulness that's been put into Mars in general. You had to pick certain sectors and certain goals and certain trajectories.
I think there was it's a story of extraordinary generosity of civic leaders and civic entrepreneurs, right? The phase 2 lands were funded initially by John Evans's family foundation at no interest. Nobody knows that story, right? So all of that, I think it was a creature of the community. The University of Toronto put money in, the hospitals put seed money in. It was a creature of born out of a sort of a shared vision that something could happen. But I think part of the powerful design principles were not being too prescriptive. The fundamental piece was we don't want to create just another palace for researchers or just an incubator. We have incubation space for startups, but we want the whole innovation food chain to bump into each other all day long. And all of our tenants work across that innovation spectrum from researchers, tech transfers, startups, mid-sized companies, multinationals, investors, and so on. And that thesis means that you have now, 3,000 people working there. It'll go to 5,000 by the end of next year, of incredibly smart, incredibly young people who are bumping into each other all day long. And you don't really know what's coming out of it. I mean, we see some of it, but a huge amount of it you never can even describe.
Like you've created a serendipity accelerator in the building.
Yeah. And quite intentional in terms of, domains of science. And if we think then about Canada as a small country in the global spectrum, our opportunity is very much in these convergent spaces. So we were talking earlier about, companies that are combining neuroscience with mobile technology, companies that are now crossing over between imaging and, security. All kinds of different convergent spaces. And if we can figure out not just the cool science that's merging, but what are the new business models, what are the new global opportunities in international markets, I think that's where we can carve out a uniquely Canadian advantage that will stay ahead of this extraordinary force of innovation as literally hundreds of millions of people are coming into the knowledge economy labor markets in emerging countries that are skipping steps. They're moving directly from emerging economies to innovation economies.
There's tons of questions up there. I think I've seen your hand up.
So, really interesting, all the stuff you're saying, and I'm interested in, you kind of covered the past and a little bit of the present, a little bit of the future of what's going on with Mars, but as far as community building and building an ecosystem like this, do you see, obviously the goal right now is to be the thought leader enough so that you can help build the industry, but is the goal of Mars to eventually actually be a facilitator so that when the industry is fully grown it is able to direct itself, or is the goal actually to be a driver and thought leader always and always help direct that industry?
I think we're one of the actors. I literally, we happen to be a big one, and we happen to have some real specialized infrastructure for the kind of companies that really need infrastructure and need the partnerships with academic centers. But I don't think the ecosystem is one thing, and that in any way, it's our job to try and contribute as much as we can in terms of thought leadership, but there's going to be always tons of other thought leadership, and there must be always tons of other thought leadership. I don't see us being anything other than, one of the hot spots, and one that's a little different probably from some of the others, and again, working, in concert with those. But as much as we can facilitate serious conversation about public policy issues, we now have, 3 funds where we've essentially had to step in to try and bring some early stage capital, and we have a private clean tech fund, for example, because there was just no money to fund some of our companies. So we are going to keep catalyzing some of these, these pools to try and fill gaps. But it is a facilitating and an enabling role, and hopefully, we can be a bit of a vanguard to pioneer some of these international relationships as landing spots, partnerships, that everybody can use. But I think this is all part of lifting the capacity in the community at all levels. Because we're not betting on just health. We're betting on all kinds of different subsectors, and that's part of the magic of Toronto. It's the diversity of its startup ecosystem. But tell us what do you think we should not do, and what do you think we should focus on, where we might be able to bring a unique concentration?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Let me be the one to tell you. I don't think I could. I guess I'm always interested in all these groups that are, the accelerator model, a lot of small scale, big scale, government organizations, everything that have to play a very dynamic place in both being there for the industry to make decisions itself, and how much of it is growth until it's self-sustaining, and how much of it is always helping kind of act. Is it planning or is it reacting and facilitating? And those are, I don't know which way it is, and I can imagine that right now Mars is a very necessary piece to help continue driving, because the industry is in its infancy. I mean, all of this is in its infancy, right? Like 10 years is minor as far as really trying to build a strong, sustainable ecosystem. But at what point, I guess, in a plan of an organization like this, is it to build it that it's so strong that it can kind of just be there to help and not to create anything more than connections for those who need them, but not have the foresight of planning. And that, I guess, that's where in all these organizations, I'm always interested in what level they are thinking that they can step away, or are they ever thinking they can step away and really wanting to drive it forever?
I think that is the evolving question, right? I mean, we've gone now to a 3-year rolling strategic plan, just to be diligent about that process and getting a lot of international input in terms of learning also from what's happening in other places, so that we can stay current. So I think it's sort of continuing to take the pulse of where can we play a role that is either not filled, or where there's an opportunity to really accelerate something that's emerging. And I would say that's one of the things that is interesting is, across the 1,000 startups that use our mentor services right now, you see these hotspots developing, right? And we're trying to build the cluster strategies around those now with corporate partners, so that there's real sort of shared knowledge and strong networks building for the companies that are taking off, rather than sort of generic IT services, or medtech services.
So we only have time for one more question. There was a hand up right there.
Hi. We're on the subject of women, startup growing women. And a couple of years ago, you had talked about how women in technology particularly were not acting on their patents, and there was a dearth of women in the venture capital and some of that. And I'm just wondering if you've seen anything shift in the last couple of years. Has there been any movement in that regard?
I guess it depends on whether you're getting me on an optimistic day on that topic. I think the data is still very depressing. There's no other way to describe it. We have been incredibly focused at Mars to bring women mentors in, to make our programs more accessible to women. It's very interesting. We run a program some of you may know about, Entrepreneurship 101, very introductory entrepreneurship program. We integrated social innovation into that without dumbing down the business content one bit, and in 1 year it went 50-50 female. So, environmental engineering is oversubscribed by women. So when you bring a values-based filter to entrepreneurship, the women come, right? So there are things that you can do. So we are now close to 20% of our startups across those 3 sectors now have a woman founder or a senior. It was 5% a few years ago. So those are good indicators. I think if I count the women in venture capital in Canada, I don't know if I get beyond one hand. And 2 of them are in our fund. So we are still incredibly challenged. And again, we don't even have a big enough sample size in Canada, but the data out of the US is very clear. When you have a female partner as a decision maker in a venture capital fund, that fund invests in more women-owned businesses. So we have a long way to go on that. And I think this is a women's issue, but it's an economic issue. We have more women graduating from our universities than men now. The majority of new jobs in modern economies come from these young high-growth firms. We take out the resource sector, which lulls us into complacency in Canada, but all of a sudden now maybe not. So we have to get more women starting, growing, and choosing to work in these companies. Areas like healthcare might be interesting vanguards because life sciences is a very strong profession from a female perspective. Nobody funding those women factors. So we still have a long way to go in terms of really just mobilizing the talent, because there's no way. So we have 32 million people. We're competing with, China, India, 1 billion plus, 300 plus million in the US. We only have half of the people on our team. Because that's what we're really trying to do if women are not at the table. So this is an issue where it's our unfinished business. And I think we cannot, for a moment, take our foot off that gas pedal.
Thank you so much, Ilse.
Thanks for having me.
I give you a challenge as female founders to consider the journey of these two women. Thank you so much for